Revelation 2389. From the 29th and the 30th of June 1942. Earth change in the law of compulsion and free will. Responsibility. For centuries the being had to endure compulsion, and this state was extremely painful because the being was originally created in freedom and was now completely deprived of freedom. Thus the path through earthly life was constantly subject to a law of compulsion, or also, God's will was decisive for both the kind of external form as well as the activity of the being which governed the path on earth. And this endless long earthly walk ends with a short time of freedom, a time where the being does not feel the compulsion so much, where it can, so to speak, use its will as it sees fit as a free, independent individual being. This time need not be agonizing in any way if the being uses its will correctly, that is in a way which corresponds to the goal and purpose of its earthly life, thus favors its higher development. Then the being will neither need to suffer nor feel its outer shell as a constraint and in a short time also become rid of it and finally be free. But if the earthly change is painful, then the being's will itself is the cause. It goes the wrong way and must be rebuked through suffering. Nevertheless, freedom of will remains with him until the end of this earthly walk in the flesh. But whether it receives its final freedom after the end of its life in the flesh depends solely on its earthly change. It can be free from all restraints, both physically and spiritually. Every cover can fall off it and the being can therefore be in complete freedom. But it can also still take over fetters into the spiritual kingdom insofar as every earthly or material desire signifies a fetter for the being. Then it can, under certain circumstances, have to endure pressure of such fetters again for endless times, depending on its will to free itself from this desire. Although the being no longer feels physical fetters, the fetters of the spirit are all the more agonizing, for they weigh the being down extraordinarily. For since the being's original state was freedom and power, it was not subject to any constraint, whereas now it cannot yet freely determine and act, which the being will certainly become aware of in the beyond after its earthly life, which had brought it free will. And therefore it suffers from the unfree state, albeit in a different way than in the stages before its embodiment as a human being, where it lived on earth in a certain state of compulsion. For in this state every activity and form was prescribed for the beingness, and it could not resist. But now the state of compulsion is ruled out, it is not forced into any activity but rather hindered by the lack of strength. And the once freely created feels this lack of strength particularly agonizingly. The being therefore immediately strives for spiritual freedom as soon as it realizes that its original state was a state of freedom and strength. But this realization is only the result of its rightly used will. The being in the bound state certainly always strives to become free from the present form because it feels this as agony, but it knows nothing about its original nature and its destiny. In the state of free will the compulsion through its external form is less oppressive, but the possibility of recognition is given to it, and it now depends on its will to attain full recognition, which then is also a guarantee for the final release from the form. This last test of earthly life is only of short duration, but it is completely sufficient to let the being come to realization if it does not offer resistance. But this short time on earth is also extraordinarily responsible, for it decides on life and death in eternity, that is on freedom or bondage, on strength and power or powerless lifelessness. For the latter is the being's fate. For the latter is the fate of the one who did not allow his free will to become active on earth in accordance with God's will. For eternities it had to walk through creation according to his will for the purpose of its higher development, and the short time of freedom of will it now has to strive for and continue this of its own accord. If the being fails, then its will is still turned away from God, and therefore it cannot stay close to God. Thus it cannot receive strength and light from God. Consequently its state is without strength and light, which unspeakably depresses the once freely and perfectly created spiritual being. Whereas the spiritual being, which has regained its original state through a will constantly turned towards God, can work in spiritual freedom and unlimited power and abundance of strength for its own happiness. And the decision about this is placed in the hands of the human being on earth. His earthly change and his will is decisive as to which fate the soul, the being from God, will one day be granted. Amen.